The Parsec Awards are a set of annual awards created to recognize excellence in science fiction podcasts and podcast novels. The awards were created by Mur Lafferty, Tracy, Hickman and Michael R.Mennenga and awarded by FarPoint Media. They were first presented in 2006 at DragonCon and have since become one of the most recognizable honors in science and fiction podcasting. Nominations are accepted from the listening public annually in each of the categories. The list is vetted for eligibility by the steering committee, before producers are invited to submit samples of work for consideration by a panel of judges. The panel reduces the list of nominees to 5 finalists in each category. The finalists' work is submitted for judging and the winner is selected by that panel of authors, podcasters, and others knowledgeable in the field of speculative fiction, podcasting, and/or publishing. Past finalist judges have included Catherine Asaro, Charles DeLint, Cory Doctorow, and Evo Terra. Award categories. Categories are modified from year to year. This is a list of some past categories: Best Speculative Fiction Story, Small Cast; Best Speculative Fiction Story, Small Cast; Best Speculative Fiction Story, Small Cast; Best Speculative Fiction Story, Large Cast; Best Speculative Fiction Story, Large Cast; Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama; Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama; Best Speculative Fiction Video Story Podcast; Best Speculative Fiction Magazine or Anthology Podcast; Best Speculative Fiction Comedy Parody Podcast; Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast; Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast; Best Podcast About Speculative Fiction Content Creation; Best Fact Behind the Fiction Podcast; Best New Speculative Fiction Podcaster Team; Best Speculative Fiction Music Podcast. Past winners: 2014 Best Speculative Fiction Story, Growth Spurt by Paul Dorello; Best Speculative Fiction Story Small Cast, Blood and Smoke by Mike Bennett; Best Speculative Fiction Story Small Cast, Underwood and Flinch, a vampire novel by Mike Bennett; Best Speculative Fiction Story Large Cast, Dirty Hands by Niall Kitson; Best Speculative Fiction Story Long Form, Fire on the Mound by William J. Mayer; Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama, Torlington by John Thrower; Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama, We're Alive, A Story of Survival by Casey Wayland; Best Speculative Fiction Video Story, Once Upon a Time in the 1970s by Chris Namp and Luke Min; Best Speculative Fiction Magazine or Anthology Podcast, The Nosleep Podcast edited by David Cummings; Best New Speculative Fiction Podcaster Team, Richard Wentworth, Michael McQuilkin, Lisa McQuilkin, and Michael Atkinson of Hadron Gospel Hour; Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast, Cyborgs, a bionic podcast hosted by John S. Drew and Paul K. Bisson; Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast, Sword and Amp, Laser hosted by Veronica Belmont and Tom Merritt; Best Podcast About Speculative Fiction Content Creation, Story Wonk Sunday hosted by Lani Diane Rich and Alistair Stevens; Best Fact Behind the Fiction Podcast, Universe Today's Guide to Space hosted by Fraser Kane; Best Speculative Fiction Comedy Parody Podcast, DragonCon TV hosted by Brian Richardson; Best Speculative Fiction Music Podcast, Insufficient Submissions; Best Youth-Driven Speculative Fiction Podcast, Insufficient Submissions; 2013 Best Speculative Fiction Story, Now Sidonia by Rick Kennett; Best Speculative Fiction Story Small Cast, The Shadow over Innsmouth by H. P. Lovecraft, produced by Mike Bennett; Best Speculative Fiction Story Small Cast, Underwood and Flinch by Mike Bennett; Best Speculative Fiction Story Large Cast. The Road to Utopia Plain by Rick Kennett. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama The Minister of Chance by Radio Static. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama Star Trek Outpost by Tony Raymond and Daniel McIntosh. Best Speculative Fiction Video Story I Have Your Heart by Molly Crabapple, Kim Birkbinder and Amp Jim Batt. Best Speculative Fiction Magazine or Anthology Podcast Tales from the Archives Volume 2 by T. Morris and Pip Ballantyne. Best New Speculative Fiction Podcaster Team The No Sleep Podcast by David Cummings. Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast Rebel Force Radio by Jimmy Mack and Jason Swank. Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast Nights at the Round Table by Ash Fabrother. Best Podcast About Speculative Fiction Content Creation Story Forward by J.C. Hutchins and Amp Steve Peters. Best Fact Behind the Fiction Podcast Hubblecast by Ollie Usher and Amp Joe Liskey. Best Speculative Fiction Comedy Parody Podcast Blastra Podcast by Mark Solopf. Best Speculative Fiction Music Podcast The Funny Music Project by Devo Spice. Best Youth-Driven Speculative Fiction Podcast Insufficient Entries. 2012 Best Speculative Fiction Story Precarious Child by Pip Ballantyne. Best Speculative Fiction Story Small Cast Insufficient Submissions. Best Speculative Fiction Story Small Cast Underwood and Flinch A Vampire Novel by Mike Bennett. Best Speculative Fiction Story Large Cast The Seven by P.C. Haring. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama Keeg's Quest, A Skyrim Adventure by Rich Matheson. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama The Mask of Inanna by Alicia Goranson. Best Speculative Fiction Video Story Insufficient Submissions. Best Speculative Fiction Magazine or Anthology Podcast Drabblecast. Best New Speculative Fiction Podcaster Team Toasted Cake featuring Tina Connolly. Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast The Signal. Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast The Incomparable. Best Podcast About Speculative Fiction Content Creation Writing Excuses. Best Fact Behind the Fiction Podcast Monster Talk. Best Speculative Fiction Comedy Parody Podcast Supervillain Corner. Best Speculative Fiction Music Podcast Radio Free Hipster. Best Youth-Driven Speculative Fiction Podcast Insufficient Submissions. 2011 Best Speculative Fiction Story Saying the Names by Maggie Clark. Best Speculative Fiction Story Kissyman and Amp The Gentleman by Scott Seigler. Best Speculative Fiction Story Owner's Show by Nathan Lowell. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama The Radio Adventures of Dr. Floyd by Grant Basiocco and Amp Doug Price. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama H.G. World by J. Smith. Best Speculative Fiction Video Story Grant's Advent Calendar Video Podcast. Best Speculative Fiction Magazine or Anthology Podcast Drabblecast. Best New Speculative Fiction Podcaster Team Cobalt City Adventures Unlimited. Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast Podculture TARDIS Interruptus. Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast What the Cast. Best Podcast About Speculative Fiction Content Creation Fullcast Podcast. Best Fact Behind the Fiction Podcast Planetary Radio. Best Speculative Fiction Comedy Parody Podcast Technorama. Best Speculative Fiction Music Podcast Renaissance Festival Podcast. Best Youth-Driven Speculative Fiction Podcast Aaron's World. 2010 Best Speculative Fiction Story The Tank by Scott Seigler. Best Speculative Fiction Story Personal Effects Sword of Blood by J.C. Hutchins. Best Speculative Fiction Story Captain's Show by Nathan Lowell. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama. The Metamor City Podcast Whispers in the Wood by Chris Lester. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama. Decoder Ring Theatre by Greg Taylor. Best Speculative Fiction Video Story. Gold. Season 1 by David Nett and Amp. Andrew R. Deutsch. Best Speculative Fiction Magazine or Anthology Podcast. The Drabblecast edited by Norm Sherman. Best New Speculative Fiction Podcaster Team in the Gloaming by Nathaniel Tapley. Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast. The Signal featuring Curry Haley, Kevin Batchelder, Cara Helgren, Les Howard, Jutta Jordans, Dave Tomasic, Andy King, Nick Edwards, Miranda Thomas, Helen Eaton, Anna Snyder, James Parkinson, and Amp. Jill Arroway. Best Speculative Fiction Fan and News Podcast. Galactic Watercooler featuring Audra, Chuck, and Amp. Sean. Best Podcast about Speculative Fiction Content Creation. Writing Excuses featuring Brandon Sanderson, Dan Wells, Eric James Stone, Howard Tyler, and Amp. Stacey Whitman. Best Fact Behind the Fiction Podcast. Skeptoid featuring Brian Dunning. Best Speculative Fiction Comedy Parody Podcast. Technical Difficulties featuring Kay and Chris Conroy. Best Speculative Fiction Music Podcast. Radio Free Hipster featuring Zed. 2009 Best Speculative Fiction Story. FETIDUS. The Foundation for the Ethical Treatment of the Innocently Damned, Undead and Supernatural by James Durham. Best Speculative Fiction Story. Social Networking by Scott Seigler. Best Speculative Fiction Story. Under the Bed by Michael Natale. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama. The Radio Adventures of Dr. Floyd. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama. Metamor City, Making the Cut. Best Speculative Fiction Infotainment Podcast. The 365 Days of Astronomy, the daily podcast of the International Year of Astronomy 2009. Best Speculative Fiction Comedy Parody Podcast. Bells in the Bat-Free. Best Speculative Fiction Magazine or Anthology Podcast. Pseudopod. Best Anime Podcast. Anime World Order. Best Speculative Fiction Fan Podcast. The Scapecast. Best Speculative Fiction Video Podcast. Stranger Things. Best Gaming Podcast. Brilliant Gameologists. Best Speculative Fiction Music Podcast. The Fump. Best Writing-Related Podcast. Writing Excuses. Best Speculative Fiction News Podcast. Shite on the Tube featuring Bruce Moyle, Chris Rattray, David Quinn, Dion Brooks and Tian Double. Best New Speculative Fiction Podcaster Team. FETIDUS. The Foundation for the Ethical Treatment of the Innocently Damned, Undead and Supernatural. 2008 Best Speculative Fiction Story. Red Man by Scott Seigler. Best Speculative Fiction Story. Heaven, Season 4, Wasteland by Mur Lafferty. Best Speculative Fiction Story. Playing for Keeps by Mur Lafferty. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama. Space Casey by Christiana Ellis. Best Speculative Fiction Audio Drama. Billabub Baddings and the Case of the Singing Sword by T. Morris. Best Speculative Fiction Video Podcast. Stranger Things. Best Speculative Fiction Magazine or Anthology Podcast. Variant Frequencies. Best Speculative Fiction Comedy Parody Podcast. Shortcomings Audio. Best Speculative Fiction Fan Podcast. Galactica Quorum. Best Speculative Fiction News Podcast. Slice of Sci-Fi. Best Writing-Related Podcast. Adventures in Sci-Fi Publishing. Best Infotainment Cast. The Weird Show. Best Gaming Podcast. The Game Kennel. 2007 Best Speculative Fiction Story. No World for Warriors. Variant Frequencies by Matt Wallace. Best Speculative Fiction Story, The Arwen by Timothy P. Callahan. Best Speculative Fiction Story, The Immortals by Tracy Hickman. Best Audio Drama, The Radio Adventures of Dr. Floyd by Grant Basiocco, Doug Price. Best Audio Drama, Prometheus Radio Theatre by Stephen H. Wilson, Scott D. Farquhar. Best Audio Production, The Radio Adventures of Dr. Floyd by Grant Basiocco, Doug Price. Best Video Production, Missing Pages by Jerome Olivier. Best Video Podcast, Missing Pages by Jerome Olivier. Best Non-Speculative Fiction, Number 1 with a Bullet by Mark Yoshimoto Nemkopf. Best Fan Podcast, The Signal by Jill Arroway, Les Howard, Gary Haley, and AMP Crew. Best Speculative Fiction News Podcast, Skepticality, the official podcast of Skeptic Magazine by Derek Colanduno and AMP Robin Swoopy McCarthy. Best Anime Podcast, Weeknights Wednesdays, Anime Manga Comics by Raymond Scott. Best Gaming Podcast, Pulp Gamer Inside Track. Best Graphic Literature Podcast, Comics Radar by J.M. Campbell and Matt Melnick. Best Infotainment Cast, Pulp Gamer Out of Character. Best Reality Podcast, Tag in the Seam by Leanne. Best Tech Podcast, The Command Line by Thomas Gideon. Best Writing-Related Podcast, I Should Be Writing by Mur Lafferty. 2006 Best Fiction, Absolution Insured by Matt Wallace. Best Fiction, How to Succeed in Evil by the Sinachai and AMP Patrick McLean. Best Audio Production, Virgin Falls by Jeff Folchinsky. Best Writing Podcast, The Secrets by Michael A. Stackpole. Best Audio Drama, The Stargate Cafe by Planet Retcon. Best Audio Drama, The Radio Adventures of Dr. Floyd by Grant Basiocco and AMP Doug Price. Best Fiction, Death of a Dishwasher by the Sinachai and AMP Patrick McLean. Best Fan Podcast, The Scapecast by Kevin Batchelder, Lindy Ray, and Crew. Best News Podcast, The Future in You by Stephen Ewenkopp. Award Ceremony. Hosts Tom Merritt and Justin Robert. Young Musical Guest Sarah Donna. Host Veronica Belmont and Scott Seigler. Musical Guest Tom Smith. Host Veronica Belmont and Scott Seigler. Musical Guest Erin Hill and Marion Call. Host Christiana Ellison. George H.R.A.B. Musical Guest Mark Gunn. Hosts Christiana Ellison. George H.R.A.B. Musical Guest. Hosts Mur Lafferty and John C.M.A.R. Musical Guest. Hosts Musical Guest